Okay, so for our next talk, it's my pleasure to introduce Yuille, who's a professor of cognitive and computer science at Johns Hopkins and has made many amazing contributions to computer vision. So let's make him feel welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. So, the talk I'm going to give is really an opinion talk, so there's not really going to be any mathematics in it, just a lot of hot air opinions, but I may try and persuade you that some of them are worth thinking about. So this came out of an opinion paper that I wrote with a student, Yuille, called Deep Nets, What Have They Ever Done for Vision? And perhaps, given that the room is very crowded, I should mention I gave rather a similar talk yesterday, so if anyone heard that talk yesterday and is in the room, you might find it more comfortable to step outside because you won't get anything more from me today that you haven't heard that. Okay, so Deep Nets, What Have They Ever Done for Vision, which for anyone English here is slightly reminiscent of Monty Python. And I should say, partially because of my two department appointments, it means that I'm among people who really believe in deep networks. I'm in really people in cognitive science who are very suspicious about them and will pick on any story to say deep networks are not a good thing. And we're trying to sort of draw a balance between them. So I think fair to say that compared to human observers, deep nets are brittle and rely heavily on annotated data sets. And like humans, deep nets have difficulty learning from small numbers of examples. I don't mean to say they can't. People publish papers on it, including our own group, but still, they're nowhere near as well performing as they can when they've got large amounts of data. Oversensitive to context, problems transferring between different domains, and lack interpretability. So what are the challenges that deep nets and deep work architectures will have to overcome? What modifications will they need to address the challenges? And in particular, possibly my main point, I'd argue that many vision tasks may be combinatorially complex, and that's something that I think as a field we may have to come to terms with and see how to address. So, what sort of limitations do we have? I gave a few in the first slide: the data set bias, domain transfer, lack of robustness. But perhaps underlying all of those, I think, is the combinatorial explosion. So here are some examples which are given by made by one of my students, which helped get one or two grant proposals. And some people may have seen these, but the idea here is you can give this monkey a guitar and you transform the monkey into a human. And I didn't realize until I gave the first talk using this slide that at the same time you transfer the guitar into a bird. The reason being, presumably, that the deep network has never seen a human with a guitar, has never seen a monkey with a guitar, but has seen a human. So it starts thinking that the monkey may be a human. At the same time, it's never seen a guitar with a monkey, but it's seen a guitar with a monkey in the jungle, etc. So, similarly with this penguin and the South Pole, you give them the penguin a TV set, and the penguin becomes a human too. There are other examples of this sort. There's a paper by Rosenfeld, Sotos, and others recently called The Elephant in the Room, which I think makes many similar points. You can change the image, put an elephant in the room, and that can cause problems with deep nets, finding objects in places that seem rather different. So deep networks, that's an oversensitivity possibly to context and lack of ability to deal with occlusion. Here was a sort of a cognitive science experiment. As a cognitive scientist, part of the time I have to publish papers about it. Here you do experiments to see whether humans can classify objects when they're occluded. The occluders are, whatever, whiskey bottles, birds, various things like that, and you compare that to deep networks. So these are fairly extreme occlusions. The humans make almost no mistakes at all. The only one that they make occasionally is, I think, a motorbike is a bicycle, and if there's a lot of occlusion, that's perhaps a reasonable mistake to make. Some motorbikes actually do look like bicycles. If you take things like AlexNet, ResNet, VGG, they've got, they're not performing badly. This is actually, like many things, incredibly good compared to computer vision before deep networks, but still they're making types of mistakes that no human would ever make. So, again, somewhat, again, deep nets have sensitivity to occlusion context, but that's only one of several challenges. Dataset bias is another challenge. This has arisen every time that computer vision researchers have started making datasets. And the problem is perhaps that any dataset is inevitably a finite set of samples from the enormous domain of real images, and this induces biases. Biases like rare events. But rare event may not mean the thing is really necessarily rare, it just means it may be rare in that data set. And rare events are things that you really need to care about in many cases. I mean, if computer vision is now being successful, maybe it needs to raise its standards of performance up to a higher level, and rare events in an automated car can kill you. Rare events in detecting tumors in pancreatic cancer can also cause a patient to be killed. So rare events are, are important. Okay, but again, getting back to perhaps the bigger problem underlying this is when the data set's going to be big enough. Deep learning, is a learning-based method, and like all machine learning methods, they assume that the observed data are random samples from some underlying and unknown distribution P of xy. And there have been theoretical studies, people like Vapnik, Les Valiant, Smelt, and Poggio, etc., and there are a series of theorems called probably approximately correct theorems. And these guarantee that with certain conditions, that if you have enough examples on a finite size trading data set, you can believe that it's going to apply to everything else that comes from this underlying distribution. In practice, the theorems are not very useful because you can't actually compute anything with them, and to some extent they're making rather paranoid sort of assumptions, considering the worst possible case or the worst possible case that could happen, but nevertheless, they do give fundamental bias, fundamental support for this type of idea. But the theoretical studies require that the annotated data sets for training and testing deep nets are sufficiently large to be representative of the underlying problem domain. So when will the data sets be big enough is a question you have to start asking yourselves. So I was asked this myself a few years ago because of a practical project on detecting pancreatic cancer. So they asked me, okay, how many pancreases do we need to segment? How many tumors do we need to find in the pancreas? And I said, I don't have any idea. How do I know? So I guess some numbers, the numbers seem to be, maybe they're reasonably right. But in any case, the problem domain here was a fairly well-defined and constrained domain. The pancreas varies between different people, but the variations are not huge. The types of tumors and things you can get in pancreases are, varied as well, but the variation is not enormous. So it's a big domain, but it's also a fairly constrained domain. If the goal is to recognize faces, and the face data sets need to be big enough to capture the variability of faces, but this is also a well-defined and constrained domain. This is face recognition from front on. Faces, front on, are pretty similar to, every face is pretty similar to every other face. And again, the domain is pretty much constrained, and I'm told that there are face recognition systems that will work on, hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions by now, depending on what data sets are available. But again, it's fairly constrained. and great data sets are needed, but they're finite and it seems possible to obtain them. But for many vision tasks, the domains are much larger. So first point that's sort of obvious is the space of images is infinite. I actually once wrote down almost infinite and I got very strongly criticized by a referee who said he didn't know what that meant. But infinite, okay, you quantize it, fine, but still, yeah, basic set of images you can have is really enormous, and which means, among other things, that for every image you have in your data set, there's an infinite number of images which are also infinitesimally close to the images in your data set. And this, of course, is exploited by digital adversarial attacks because you attack the network by differentiation and you try and do some minor perturbation that produces an image that's infinitesimally close to one of the ones in your data set, but where your deep network will give you completely the wrong answer. So this is a problem. However, it may not be serious because deep nets can probably be trained to deal with this to some extent. There's very nice theoretical work coming out from, I think, MIT, min-max principle, etc. And there are defenses for digital attacks which are reasonably successful. Not perfect, but this may be a solvable problem. Now, look from another perspective to computer graphics. So if you're taking a rendering model for a 3D virtual scene from an image, there'll be several parameters that constrain it. The camera pose, the lighting, the texture, the material of the scene layout. And if you have 13 parameters, and I'll show them in the next slide, and you just have 1,000 values for each of them, then you've got a data set for a single object. And 10 to the 39 is big. Okay? I'm not sure if or when anyone's going to get a data set of that size, but certainly nobody's got a data set like that now. Deep nets may be able to deal with this. There are this incredible number of images, but all of them are fairly, a lot of them are fairly similar to each other. Deep nets won't may be able to do with it, but they may require many examples to do it. And if you think about it, they may perform worse than an algorithm that says, wait a moment, the data has been generated by 13 parameters, so it lies on some 30-dimensional manifold. And if we can identify the manifold by factorizing the geometry, texture, and the lighting, then maybe we can solve the problem, or at least that particular problem, far more simply. Okay, so here images from synthetic data, distance, angles, lighting, etc. Changes like that. Change the foreground, the background, with a few examples. And any real computer graphics system is going to be a lot more complicated, far more parameters you can put on top of it, and so on. And here was the number, 10 to the 39, just from that data set. Okay, I think I might say a little bit about factorizing geometry, texture, and lighting because I don't know how many people think that way. In the 90s, this was not, was a reasonably common thing for people to discuss. So first, a question here on this image on the left. Does anyone want to know what's going on here? Anyone who hasn't seen this image before? Yeah? Oh, no. What is this image of? What is this yellow structure? Well, my own guess when I first saw this image was that there was somehow they arranged to have a large sheet of glass here, which they painted yellow, yellow here, and had a hole in the middle. That's possible. However, if you look at the shadows, that's quite inconsistent with the shadows. And the answer is simply, they just painted the walls. So this is a case where just by slight change of texture, color painting yellow here, yellow here, yellow here, yellow here, yellow here, they give the impression of something that's really very different from what's actually there. this is actually a counterexample to what I'm saying, that humans can usually factorize geometry, texture, and lighting, but this is an example to show that this time they can't. Over here, there's a nice video. I think this is from Toyota, and you see people seem to do death-defying feats, like sort of jumping from one of these bars over to one of those bars. But again, you've been fooled. There is a nice flat plane here that people are standing on, and people have just drawn these things in there as changes of texture, and these people are perfectly safe, and nothing's going to happen to them. Still, the idea that you could factorize geometry, texture, and lighting, I think Ted Adelson had a paper on this 15 years ago, is, I think, an important underlying concept. And so for the computer graphics models, knowing that you've got that factorization makes it conceivable that you could learn it, at least in simple cases, from very different examples. But this has still been an aside. My main concern is combinatorial complexity. So combinatorial possibilities arise when you start placing objects together in visual scenes. If you've got n objects and you've got n possible locations in the scene, you're rapidly into a combinatorial exponential number of possibilities that you can have. It can also apply to even to single objects. If you take a single rigid object and occlude it, you could occlude it in n possible places by m possible patterns, and again, you've got an exponential number of possible images. Now, perhaps most of these combinatorial possibilities rarely happen. Maybe they're rare events that don't happen very often, but as I said earlier, in the real world, rare events can kill people, failing to find a pancreatic tumor, an automatic car not detecting a pedestrian, or failing to find a baby sitting in the road, which is, of course, unlikely to be in your training set. So this is to make you think that if you think of any sort of realistic scene, surely there's got to be a combinatorial number of possible scenes that you can create. And so what happens if this is true, and what happens if you throw a machine learning algorithm like a deep net at it? You face two problems. One problem basically being, how can you train an algorithm from a finite amount of data which will generalize to combinatorial amounts? The basic underlying pack theories, I think, would say that this seems to be almost impossible unless you really know what you're training, what model you're training, which means you might have had to actually solve the problem in the first place anyway. So a question for deep nets is, can they generalize in this manner? In that respect, the sensitivity to context and occluders is worrying. Unless that can be fixed, there seems to be a huge potential problem arising there. Another problem is how you test algorithms on finite amounts of data, but assume that they're going to work on this combinatorial amount. The basic way computer vision has worked over the last 5 or 10 years is you have a testing set, you have a training set, you have a testing set, and you assume that your results from your testing set mean that they're going to work throughout the domain that you're interested in. And I'm saying if you're combinatorially complex, then this is not going to follow at all. You need to find a way to test the algorithms over all these possible combinatorial situations without actually having to do it, because trying to do it by brute force is not going to be possible. Okay. So, practical, what to do, you might be able to develop strategies where the deep network actually searches for a combinatorial large space to find good training data, a sort of active robot or something like that. And again, can you take deep nets? Can you find some sort of architecture that can learn from small amounts and then generalize to combinatorial large amounts? Okay. And another point that comes up here, I think, is that, well, our general testing and all our theories are based on average case performance. If the data set's really big, you really care about worst case performance perhaps, and worst case performance over this combinatorial space. And this requires having to test, actively search over the data set to find the most difficult examples. For me, this seems to require generalizing the idea of adversarial attacks away from the common mechanism now, where you just do small digital attacks, which are sort of, after all, local perturbations. And as I said, they may not be, they are things that you should pay attention to, but they are potentially solvable. I'm more concerned about attacks which are due to throwing occluders onto objects or throwing patches onto them, and in a sort of rather non-differentiable way. So, just to put a slogan there, you want to let your worst enemy test your algorithm, because your worst enemy, if they hate you enough, they will work out what is the best way to make your algorithm fail. So can deep networks deal with this combinatorial complexity? And again, just to remind you of the penguin with the guitar, the penguin with the TV set and the monkey with the guitar, it seems that the deep networks have some difficulty with occlusion and with unusual context. So, can deep nets deal with complexity? What's the time, by the way? Just a few more minutes, yeah. Okay. And my opinion is that they'll need to be augmented in three ways. For people who know me, it's not surprising I put compositionality at the top. And by compositionality, I mean semantic compositionality. I don't mean compositionality in terms of functions or functions. Deep networks are compositional functions, but that's not what I'm meaning here. I'm meaning the idea that objects will be represented by, in terms of parts, the parts could be represented in terms of subparts and so on. A second point is that you should start having 3D geometry to represent objects in terms of geometry requires generalizing across viewpoints, which is important, rather than just simply being trained from every possible viewpoint. The third point gets back to this factorization into geometry, material, texture, and lighting. So contrast deep nets with compositional nets. Trying to do compositional deep nets is an alternative architecture which contains explicit representations of parts. It's been sort of demonstrated that deep nets have some capability of having internal representations of parts, but they're implicit, they're stuck in there somewhere, that it's not very easy to access them and deal with them. So if you have something which has explicit representation of parts like a compositional deep net, it means they can be more robust to occluders without having to train on them, because they can automatically switch off subregions of the image which are occluded. It goes back to earlier models that people had pre-deep networks where you have voting mechanisms, and if you have enough votes, that gives you, for an object, even if some of the possible votes are not present. With these models, it's the same sort of intuition. You need to have the votes, the parts have to be found, but more particularly, they have to be found roughly in the right types of positions. And this can be formulated in these compositional models, and as opposed to outside, which will describe it. I don't mean these are certainly not alternatives to deep networks yet. This is for a particular data set with a particular set of object categories being vehicles, and there's a lot more to be done on that. And I can challenge deep networks to come back and try and do it without this approach. But for me, I think having composition and explicit parts is one important way that combinatorial complexity can be dealt with. Here are examples of the models being trained, being tested on London buses with increasingly large amounts of occlusion. You take a stranded V2G net, it does almost perfectly if there's no occlusion. As you increase the amount of occlusion, it still performs fairly well. As you make the occlusion bigger and bigger, however, it starts degrading fairly badly. Taking the compositional type of models down here, they work just about as well as a deep network when there's no occlusion, but they degrade far more gracefully when as the occlusion gets bigger. Here, they're performing still at, say, 80, almost 90% when the deep works down to the low 40s. 3D geometry, if you represent an object as a three-dimensional model, it enables you to recognize it from unusual viewpoints. We have a poster illustrating this. I don't mean, again, we're the only people doing this. This is just the easiest slide for me to pick up, where if you train from one or two, it's limited number of viewpoints, have a 3D model incorporated, then you can predict what the object's going to look like from viewpoints you haven't seen, and so you can do better than if you don't. At the end, I just wanted to put up a couple of quick slides here, just to say, okay, if we want to have combinatorial data sets, how can we do them? We could generate them using computer graphics, and if you have computer graphics, it allows you to stress test algorithms by looking at the sort of unusual cases. So for here, very early example, take a sofa detector trained on ImageNet, move the sofa around, look at it from viewpoints, and you'll find some viewpoints it just doesn't work on at all. Okay, you'd have to be sure that these viewpoints existed in your testing set to know that the algorithm was failing in that situation. Another example is on binocular stereo. It's known what factors make binocular stereo difficult: specularity, lack of texture, disparity jumps, transparency. You aren't going to have data sets that really capture those properties, or if you do, it's going to be incredibly painful for somebody to have to label them. But what you can do with computer graphics is see how the algorithms degrade when you, improve the amount of specularity, reduce the texture, and so on, and do all those types of things. So finally, last example, activity recognition. Here is an example. Activity recognition to me seems to be one of the situations where the combinatorial complexity is going to kick in very early. Actions can occur in many different situations. You can do them in many different backgrounds, and the data sets don't necessarily capture that. So here is an example. Here is the UCF 101 data set. Here is somebody boxing generated by computer graphics, and I guess most people would think that this person is boxing, but a deep network trained on this does not. Okay, why? A deep network trained on that type of data is able to extract out other information which enables it to distinguish it between other activities in those classes, and by doing various things like this class activation maps, you can see what's happening. It looks rather as if the deep network is looking for the ropes of the boxing ring and classifying it as boxing because it's found those ropes. That would actually be a very sensible way of classifying whether people are boxing in a boxing ring, but it's not really a way of classifying boxing. So the point here being, this is just so you're having lateral transfer between that domain and this one because the backgrounds are different. On the other hand, you can test with this person, you can put this boxer in any type of background, any combinatorially complex background, and see whether the algorithms still work. So, summary, as I say, this is an opinion paper. There are no real proofs here or anything of that sort. But I think the key challenges that you face with deep learning or any machine learning method in the future, as you push to the frontiers of what they can do, is going to fall down on the amount of complexity of the data sets. If the complexity of the task that you're trying to study is combinatorial, then any machine learning method evaluated in the current way that we evaluate them is not going to do a good job. You may be doing well on the data set, even doing, on the training set and the test data set, but it's not really going to generalize to the real world. So anyway, so my main point is I'd argue that the real world, images in the real world are, once you go beyond faces, beyond local parts, they're combinatorially complex, and I don't see how our current methods can deal with that directly. And so I think as a community, that's something we need to think about and study to see how to go forward. I've suggested some modifications that might be necessary, so these are my own personal opinions: compositionality, 3D geometry, and factorizability, and there could be many others. My predictions in computer vision have been wrong many times in the past, as have most other people, which I'd have to say to give an excuse. But still, I think arguments for compositionality in terms of parts make some sense. 3D geometry, the world is 3D. 3D structure is far more regular, predictable than what goes on in the two-dimensional images. Factorizing between geometry, appearance, and lighting is done by the computer graphics community, who are now able to generate fairly realistic images. And so, as a computer vision community doing inverse computer graphics, we ought to take it more seriously. And then putting in a plugin for computer graphics, which I didn't believe in very much 5 years ago because the quality of the images was not very good. But it seems now that the quality is fairly reasonable, but also it gives you one tool that you can use to study this problem, because you can make a data set which has a combinatorial number of possible images by specifying a computer graphics program that can do it. I don't mean that one should rely on computer graphics alone. Obviously, it needs to be done in combination with realistic images. But it does seem to me that computer graphics offers the tool to try and get at this complexity problem, but I can't see how you can do it otherwise. Okay.
Thank you. So if we have any questions for Alan from the Woods?
Thank you, Professor, for the very inspiring talk. But my question is, so are you actually suggesting, I think, not only deep nets and not only computer vision tasks, so are you actually suggesting that any machine learning method is useless because every real-world application other than computer vision will facing enormous complexity of the vision?
No, I'm not going to go that far. I spend half my time defending deep networks and saying how wonderful they are, and the other half attacking them. I think if they're in their place, they're a very useful tool. So the project for finding cancer tumors, I think they will work on that, but that's a domain where there isn't combinatorial complexity. Everyone's pancreas is in roughly the same position, it's got varied shape, with limited types of tumors on it. That's fine. For faces, again, that's fine unless you start putting tumors on it. And so I think if you go down to a fairly small scale task without much variation, it's all fine. No problem with it at all. I'm just saying that one has to realize that the world is more complex than that. And again, as a long-time believer in compositionality, the idea is, if you could find parts parts of things maybe you can find by deep networks, and then you compose them together by other more traditional type of mechanisms. That's quite believable. So I'm saying they're very useful tools, but they're not the only tool. Joking with my students, I said you should make deep networks your slaves. You should not be slaves to deep networks.
Any other questions?
Well, currently you can see like generative adversarial networks, they usually generate like overall high quality images, but if you look closely to see components that never generates, like human faces or like characters or numbers, you can see it's less. Do you think that that your idea would help GANs to generate like better quality images?
If I wanted to generate images, I appeal to computer graphics rather than to GANs, to be frank. I've been a long-term believer that you ought to have generative models of images, and that vision will be solved when you can do analysis by synthesis and invoke computer graphics. The underlying objects, you need certain types of structure, and in computer graphics you put in all that structure, you encode it, and then you generate the images. And with GANs it seemed to me too much that you were sort of trusting that learning and so on would enable you to learn those internal representations from scratch, and I thought that's a very hard problem, and I'd love to see it being done, and I challenge my students to come up with a GANs paper that really impresses me. But as I say, I think my standards in that respect are high because I've believed that you need generative models for a long time, and GANs was coming across to me a bit as possibly as a false prophet. Yeah.
So all the failures and problems with deep nets are related to, when we compare them with humans, right? Humans don't feel it, but humans do. So to what extent do you think we should actually look into biology and perception to set constraints on our new networks rather than infinitely dimensional spaces and data and so on?
Well, I believe in doing that. I mean, I believe, I don't know how to solve these problems, so I explore all different aspects. So I do have a project with a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins who's precisely trying to look at what neurons in the monkey cortex are doing when they're very stimulated. And it's really quite interesting. He'd argued that the neurons, even in the ventral stream P1, which is doing object recognition, he would argue that they're actually sensitive to three-dimensional structure, that they're somewhat invariant to various lighting changes and so on. And so I think at least gives one a different way of thinking about it. Having said that, doing deep, in a way, I think of computer vision as a very complex problem. I think of understanding the brain as a complex problem. So sometimes I think trying to understand the biology to understand the brain is sort of a complexity squared type problem. But nevertheless, yes, we're at least doing some joint collaborative projects on that. And I'm hoping that at some stage, thinking you may get really interesting findings out from that.
I agree with you on the problems facing in your technology. So one thing I'd like to ask about your opinion is about, isn't it the problem of scale of models rather than algorithms of itself deal with those combinatorial complexities of the real world?
The models of the algorithms, sometimes with deep nets, it's hard to distinguish them to some extent. You have your output as a differentiable function of the input in various parameters, and you can make more and more complex models of that type. But still, you're basically relying on things like differentiating that in order to do the learning. And I felt, at least with the compositional models, you need to do other things. You need to do clustering and a lot of other things inside it to get that to work. But I think it's partially, for myself, it's believer that the models ought to be interpretable, which sort of part-based models are, and interpretable AI is, I think, you know, an important way to go forward. If you can interpret something that isn't working, then you've got some idea of how to fix it. If you've got a deep network that isn't working, you don't necessarily know how to fix it, rather than just giving it more training examples. I'm not sure that's answering your question, though.
Okay, let's discuss this.
Maybe just take one more question.
Do you see various methods of trying to make models aware of what they don't know, such as out-of distribution detection or uncertainty calibration, things like that? Do they sort of address some of the problems that you're seeing sort of from the other direction?
I'm not sure I'm really familiar enough with them to say for sure, but I
mean, I guess just if a model was able to say, at a test input, saying, this is something I have no idea about.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that you can do. In fact, that's what you try and see if a deep network's been attacked in some way. Okay, postdoc said, okay, all you have to do is use threshold at 0.7. It's that simple, but yeah, you could do that to some extent. But I don't think that's, I mean, those are useful things to do, but I don't think it goes to the underlying problem. I think you really need to bring representations back into deep learning, because representations do have this ability to do it. And I realize I'm on record for saying this before deep networks became popular at the Deep Network Conference that Jan and Kuhn organized in ICLR in, I think, 2013. I can't see, despite all the successes, there seem to be fundamental limitations, and I think parts representations are necessary to deal with them. What you're saying is helpful, but I don't think it's enough to solve it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's thank out for a great talk.